So section 1.5 we're going to cover in a couple days. So this is kind of our day one intro video. Our objective, we are going to be able to identify and use midpoints. You guys have heard of those before, and segment bisectors. So let's first take a look at segments. The bisection of a segment is a point, line, ray, or segment that divides a segment into two equal segments. That is pretty wordy. So I paused the video and wrote that out. So if you want to pause and go ahead and write this down. So a point, line, ray, or segment that divides a segment into two equal segments. So basically what it does is it cuts a segment in half. That's why it's called a bisection. It cuts it into two equal pieces. So let's say this is what it could look like. So let's say we've got, this is, I meant to make that a point, segment XY, and if we bisect it, let's say I bisect it with a line, and these two are congruent, there's my congruency marks. Let's say this is line P, pretend that's lowercase. It is lowercase, but it's hard to tell. So line P is a bisector of this segment because line P cut segment XY in half into two congruent segments. So that's what a bisection of a segment would look like. All right, we got a couple definitions and formulas to look at here. Definition of midpoint, I think you might have to fill some of this in your notes. It's the point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. So a midpoint is an actual point on a line or on a segment, and it divides the segment into two congruent segments. So in this example, it says, if C is the midpoint, what can we conclude? Well, we can conclude that it cut segment AB in half, so AC is congruent to CB. So segment AC is congruent to segment CB. That's what we can conclude. So if AC is congruent to CB, what can we conclude? So let's say that that's what you knew, that AC is congruent to CB. Then you can conclude that C is the midpoint. And remember that C is capitalized because it's identifying a point on the line. And just to be more specific, it's the midpoint of segment AB. So this is called a converse. You can look at it first saying if C is the midpoint, then the two segments are congruent. So conversely, look at it from the other way. If the two segments are congruent, then that means that C is the midpoint. It kind of goes backwards through the logic. All right, and then the last thing we're going to talk about is, well, just kidding, a couple more things. Midpoint formula. The point that divides a segment into two congruent segments, well, that is the definition of midpoint, so maybe that's a typo. Anyway, midpoint formula we're going to put down here in a second. Let's see here. We'll look at this example. On the number line below, point A is -3, so I'm going to go ahead and label that. Let's say this is -3, and point B is 15. Instead of B, let's say that point C is 15. Sorry about that. So make that change in your notes. Point C is 15. What's the value for point B if it's the midpoint of AC? So think about this. If you know that this is, kind of think about on a number line. If this is at -3 and this is at 15, and we know that B is the midpoint, how do we figure out what's halfway between -3 and 15? So basically all you have to do is add them together. -3 plus 15 tells you the total distance, and then cut it in half to figure out what's halfway between. So -3 plus 15 is 12, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. So B is equal to 6. So that's the idea of where the midpoint formula comes from. When we use midpoint formula, we're going to be looking at points on a coordinate plane, so x1, y1, x2, y2. So the formula is going to be an ordered pair, because remember midpoint is an ordered pair. All you have to do is add up the x's, so x1 plus x2, and then cut them in half. We divide it by 2. Remember, when you add these together, that gives you the total distance between them, and then cut them in half to get the halfway point. You're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the y values. You're going to do y1 plus y2, add them together, cut them in half. That's how you find a midpoint on a coordinate plane.